everyone. Welcome to College Club Online. Since 2012, we have been organizing offline lectures in Amsterdam and sometimes in New York with topics varying from global politics to how does our brain work and contemporary art. Tonight, here on this virtual stage made possible by our partners, Faber Audiovisuals and Univate, we will try to get an answer to the question, how will the current corona crisis affect the future in AI and global politics? Before I introduce you to the brilliant speaker of tonight, who's actually able to make a prediction about this, let's quickly go through the technical details of this lecture. We hope that most of you are in the audience with your webcam on and your microphone on. If you're not in the audience, you can still join us. This way we can see you right here in front of us. It also allows you to directly interact with the speaker and ask questions by pushing the button Raise Hand. Or you are on the live stream. This means you will remain in the lobby. You can ask your questions in the chat throughout the lecture, and hopefully they will be answered during or after the lecture. Now, let me introduce you to the speaker of the night. Haroon Sheikh is a senior research fellow at the WRR and a philosopher at the VU. He studied public administration, political science and philosophy in Leiden and Oxford and obtained his PhD in philosophy. In the past, he worked for investment firms Sirte and Dassim, and he was the head of the Freedom Lab think tank. Haroon is the author of The Rise of the East, Embedding Technopolis and Hydropolitics. He's a regular contributor to the NRC and the FD. So, without further ado, Haroon, the floor is yours.
Sarah, and thank you all for having me here in this fantastic environment. For the people at home, I'm here with these green screens and all these screens around us. This for me is also really a quite unique experience. I mean, I have a lot of experience giving physical lectures, also at College Club. I mean, I've been present since 2012 there. So I've done a lot of physical lectures. Ever since Corona, I've had my fair share also of webinars and speaking digitally. And I mean, as nice as that is, it is also limiting. Huh? You're usually just talking into a camera and you don't really have the contact with the people around you. So tonight for me is also really a new experience, and it's great this new form because I can see quite a few people here already. I hope all of you choose to put on your webcams also. So this kind of is like a new hybrid where we're apart but still somehow physically in the same space. Anyway, I'm really looking forward to it. We're going to talk about some really big issues today. We're going to talk about geopolitics, about technology, about globalization in 3 different parts, followed by Q&As. And first, we're going to talk about the effects of Corona on geopolitics. And to start that, let's first have a look at a video clip.
We made a great trade deal. Great. They're going to buy $250 billion worth of product. And by the way, they are online. They're doing okay. But the ink wasn't dry on that deal when the plague floated in. What's going on? A plague is floating in from China. What's going on? So the ink wasn't dry. So I guess I view the trade deal a little bit differently than I did 3 months ago. It's a great deal. I will say they are buying a lot from us, and in that way I respect. And getting along with China would be a good thing. I don't know if that's going to happen. I'll let you know. We'll let you know. I think they want to get along very much with us. But if you go back, China was going to catch us in 2019. And that was like a given. You know, you go back 5 years, 6 years, 7 years. It was always, yeah, China will catch America, catch the United States, and in 2019, and then it'll become the dominant economy. Never happened. It's not going to happen. We dominated them over the last year and a half, 2 years. We took in tens of billions of dollars in tariffs that they paid for. I gave some of that money, just a small fraction, to our farmers, which made them whole, more than whole. That's why they're all in business. Made them more than whole, and it came right out of the tariff money. And the reason we didn't pay is because China devalued their currency, and they paid. Plus, they also put additional money to it. Because if they didn't do that, nobody would have bought their product. We made a great deal because of that. That's the only reason we're able to make a good deal, because of the possibility of tariffs, because China has taken tremendous advantage of the United States. We helped rebuild China. We gave them $500 billion a year. How stupid are the people that represented our country with China and many other countries. But that's all changing. And it was in the process of changing very big. You know, again, China had a very bad year before the plague. And now I think hopefully they're going to have a great year. I want them to have a great year, but we're going to have better years than they ever had. We have a better system, much better system.
Well, always interesting to try and make sense of these kind of talks. I'm going to try to do that. Of course, the US-Chinese trade war is one of the big topics if we're talking about geopolitics today. But let's first take a bit of a step back. Let's first see if we can ask the question in more general terms. The corona is a very big crisis, an exogenous crisis, something from outside is affecting global politics. And how can we think about what kind of effect does that have? When a crisis of that magnitude happens, can we maybe think of somehow of a model or a kind of methodology to think about what effect does that have on international politics? Does it create new tensions? Does it increase existing tensions? Or perhaps could it also bring us closer together? I think for all of these different scenarios, you can see hints here and there that point into these different directions. So what I would like to do is give one suggestion. I think we can have something of a model of how a crisis like corona affects international relations. If we look at it in something like a three steps phases. Basically, you could say, well, a big crisis, and that's corona is now that has to do with health. But we can also look at comparisons in the past, like the financial crisis. Also something from the outside would impact the entire world. What does a crisis like that do to international relations? And I think then, usually we go to three phases. The first phase basically is everyone turns internally. And the first phase, no one knows exactly what's going on. Everyone is in crisis. So all these governments, basically, they freeze geopolitics. No more interest in all these conflicts abroad, whether it's in the Middle East or whether it's in Eurasia. Everyone is trying to get their own house in order. That's basically the first phase. International relations freeze. Then we get into something like a second phase. And that's an interesting but also a dangerous phase. Because that's the phase where some are still frozen, but others are no longer. That's the phase in which certain countries somehow get past the initial crisis phase, earlier than others. And that can be either because, say, they've managed to adapt to the crisis very quickly and they've done all kinds of policies so they can now continue. Or it can be because their regimes make it possible for them to do other things as well. This is something we often see with authoritarian states. In our democratic states, it is really difficult for our leaders to be busy with something else than tackling the corona crisis. We simply will not accept that our leaders will start some kind of adventure far away, thousands of kilometers. But if you have a government that really isn't that much concerned with what the public wants, then you have a chance. Then these leaders, and I'm thinking here of countries like Russia, countries like China, but also Turkey and Iran, where their leaders are more freed from public opinion, they can suddenly start to use the crisis and pursue all kinds of foreign policy goals because they know that others can't. So this is kind of a dangerous phase. Some are still frozen, and this is mostly Western democracies, and other countries have this ability to pursue foreign policy goals and try to exploit them. This is also what the picture you're seeing was about from the previous crisis. The financial crisis really hit in all earnesty in 2008, and this is what happened in August 2008. Russia invaded Georgia. All of a sudden, in the course of a few days, Russian tanks moved over the border. For years, people had been arguing about Georgia that wanted to join the NATO and it was getting closer to the European Union. And suddenly, when everyone was deep in the crisis trying to calm financial markets, Russia invaded and nobody cared. Basically, nobody had the amount of space or ability in their policy to do something about it. So these are the things that can happen in the second phase. And then finally, we get into the third phase. And the third phase is basically everyone gets past the initial crisis phase. Nobody's exactly worried about what are we dealing with. Everybody knows kind of what we're dealing with, but it's causing a lot of pain. So people and governments start to have a little bit more space to think about other things. But at the same time, their whole system is under stress. And what happens then? Then basically all the old geopolitics comes back again. The old traditional international relations come back just like before the crisis, only now they're a bit worse. Because before the crisis, perhaps countries had their tensions and problems, but many of them were moving from a position of strength. And because of the crisis, everyone is now moving from a position of weakness. So we get, again, the old conflicts, but now with a lot more tension, because everyone is trying to fight and make sure that their economy stays afloat, that their relations do not get their countries into a deeper crisis. So I would argue you have these kind of three type of steps that we're in. First, you have geopolitics is frozen. Then it's frozen for some, but not for others, and they start to take advantage. And then everyone gets into this post-crisis setting. The tensions, old tensions return, but they become more difficult, more heavy. Where are we now with Corona? I think Corona, you could basically say the first few months of the year, up until, say, April, were phase one. Nobody really knew what we were dealing with. So nobody really wanted to do anything else except make sure that their house was in order. I think now, for the last few months, we're in the second phase. Especially, different countries are still deeply in this crisis. In Europe, it's a bit less. Europe perhaps is moving to the third phase. But the United States still is deeply within the crisis. It's for a lot of countries around the world, they're still at the height of the crisis, Latin American countries. So for some of these, we see that they're already transitioning. And this, I think, is happening with China right now. China is already in a position where it can, it managed a large part of the crisis. Perhaps it's going to get more difficult. I mean, we know there's been a second outbreak in Beijing. But still, China seems already to have done a lot of policies to make sure that they've controlled the crisis to a certain amount. And at the same time, it has a regime that can think ahead. So I think we're already seeing that China is trying to take advantage here. And the same holds for countries like Russia, countries like Turkey, like Iran. So what I'm really thinking about and worrying about the coming few months is how these countries will exploit this situation. I'm looking at regions like Ukraine, Belarus, Syria, Libya, where these countries can try to take advantage. And then slowly, and I think we're slowly, globally, getting into the situation where we're all in phase 3. And what are the things that we're going to see in phase 3? I said in phase 3, the old geopolitical tensions return again, but they become more fierce. So let's have a look at what is this basic picture? What are these old tensions that are coming back to haunt us in a more difficult form? Then we go back to the video clip at the beginning. The basic, most important topic happening now globally, of course, is the tension between the United States and China. So what is this about? I would argue this is the biggest theme for geopolitics for the coming decade, at least. And it's not something that has to do with individuals or policies or mistakes or tweets or anything. That's just the news. It has to do with something much more fundamental, something that in geopolitics is called the Thucydides trap, which is basically the situation in which you have a ruling power that's becoming weaker, in this case the United States, and then ascending power that's getting to have a bigger influence on the international stage. Once you have this dynamic in place, basically everything is locking them into conflict. What the Thucydides trap says is that the normal course of things is that they're going to collide. Not if somebody makes a mistake, but the normal course of things is collision. The real hard work is actually trying to make sure this collision doesn't become a hot war. But these countries are on a collision. This is what I think is truly the case, and let's have a bit of a look deeper into that, because I think too often this is seen as, well, misguided policies by the Trump administration, and I think it's much more fundamental. If we look at the place of the United States in the world, we can note a few things. I mean, people often point to Trump and saying, well, he is really redefining the US, but I think a lot of what he's doing is actually driven by deeper structural factors. Things that he doesn't control, but that are actually much more long-term trends in which he's only a part of. And one really big trend here is US energy independence. This is something that I think doesn't get nearly enough attention globally as it should be. Not so long ago, the United States was the biggest importer of energy in the world. This is why we had all these US interventions in the Middle East. But over the last decade or so in particular, the revolution in shale energy has not only made the US more and more sufficient in energy, it's actually turning it into a vast exporter of energy. There are all kinds of extrapolations making the US actually the biggest exporter. What Saudi Arabia used to be, the United States is going to be. This is a complete redefinition of its role, and it also means that the US really doesn't need to be involved in the Middle East, in Eurasia, as much as it used to be in the past. So this big dynamic is slowly starting to change the position of the US, no longer needing it to interfere around the world. And I think another big trend concerning the US is that it's transitioning. It's transitioning its role in the world system. Yes, the US is still the most powerful and strong country in the world, but it kind of became that by accident and by nobody really getting prepared for it. It happened in '91. It was all the 20th century just fighting great powers and the Soviet Union, and in '91 that just disappeared. And suddenly the US was the sole world superpower. And it kind of remained in that mindset. Well, we used to fight wars whenever we needed to against the Soviet Union, so they kept doing it. Fighting wars in Afghanistan, fighting wars in Iraq. And now I think something very fundamentally is changing in the US. There is a stronger realization, wait a second, this is not the way we can continue. We need to become a traditional empire, which means we no longer fight wars everywhere. We take a bit of a back seat. And we try to see if we can let other countries, our allies, take over more of a role in international politics. This is, I think, a really fundamental dynamic driving what is going on right now. It's not just Trump that wants to put pressure on NATO. I think this is a dynamic the United States would face whoever was leading the country. It needs to redefine its role, and that means it needs to shift more power to its allies. Let Europe, let Japan, let other countries take a bigger role here. At the same time, we're seeing, so this is the US redefining its role. China, on the other hand, has made a tremendous shift over the last few decades. In 1979, this country made its transition to a market economy, and ever since then, its economy boomed. Just to have a bit of a hint of that impact, when the Berlin Wall fell in '91, the Chinese economy, how big do you think it would be, comparing it to other countries? It really wasn't that significant. The US economy was about as big as the Dutch economy. So the Chinese economy was just as big as the Dutch economy. After that time, and especially since 2001, it really started to grow very fast, becoming the second largest economy and getting closer and closer now in on the #1 economy, the United States. That means its role is really transforming in the international stage. When it started this project at the end of the '70s, it really just wanted to make sure its economy worked. It wanted to get people wealthy. So it was the policy idea in Beijing was always, be careful, don't put a big role on international politics. Always try to appear weaker. But with China's new power, this has changed. China now is getting more confident, it's getting more powerful. The global economy is more and more turning around it, and China has become more assertive. This is something that has happened under current President Xi Jinping. His idea of the China dream, which is not just like the American dream, individual wealth. The China dream also means a country with the most powerful army in the world. China has big plans, and as is interesting with a communist country, those plans are written on paper. So you can read them. We have the China made in 2025. We have China's big plans of the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a big project to create a whole new infrastructure around the world where all these different economies are linked to the Chinese infrastructure. And we have this very long-term ambition. And the Chinese put a specific date on this. The date is 2049. In 2049, that's the moment when the current regime, turns a century old. The communists took power in 1949. And a century from that, China really wants to be the most preeminent force in global politics. So this is where China is. And these two countries are on a collision now. So I think the big question that we have now, if you want to have a glimpse of the future geopolitics, what does that amount to? Will it be a new Cold War? This is what the current picture shows. This is the situation of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Khrushchev versus Kennedy. Will we have a similar situation, just like the US against the Soviet Union, but now with China? I don't think so. I think in this next phase, at least two things are different from the Cold War as we knew it. One thing that's different is that now we're much more economically linked. I remember in the old Cold War, you had the economically linked Western Bloc, but the Soviet Union had a completely separate economy, and the countries there weren't linked with each other. Currently, even though countries are rivals, their economies are tremendously linked amongst each other, which is also a good thing, because it means that conflict now doesn't naturally translate into military conflict, just like in the Cold War, where if you had a problem, you immediately turned to your weapons and even threatening with your nuclear arsenal. Conflict now goes through the economy. It means things like fighting over if Huawei gets to create a telecom infrastructure or not. So now we're economically more linked, and secondly, the second big thing that is different from the old Cold War is that we now see that there aren't just two poles. There are many other countries that are growing into quite a powerful center of power in the world. In Asia, we have a few: India, Russia, Japan, and also actually the European Union could be a different pole, which means we don't have to choose between this conflict between two great powers. Europe has a special role here, and I will later, in the second and third presentation, hint about what that role could be. I'll come back to that later, because I think now it's good time to have some time for some Q&A and see if there are any questions from you. So we'll later talk a bit about this multipolar world, how are all these different countries having also a role and creating not a bipolar world. But first, let's see if we have any questions here from the audience. They can come both from Zoom, so you can talk with us here, or they can be through the chat. So let's see if there are any questions or comments at the current moment. There are no questions at this moment? Yeah? Okay, well, let's then, I guess, remember these things, because I've built this up and we have like these three separate topics, and they're all going to be linked together in the third one. So all these topics are going to come back, but now let's take a look and we've now done a bit of in the first part, a bit of an overview of geopolitics, and I've argued we have this three-phase model. And we see that the US-Chinese conflict is the dominant theme in geopolitics. But also, we're not going back to a Cold War. Remember this, because now we're going to talk about technology, Corona and technology. What does that mean? Again here, first let's have a look at a video clip.
In Shanghai, life is going back to normal. But caution remains high, and new tools are being used to avoid a second wave of infections. QR codes have now become the passports that allow Chinese people to move around. To get into a shop, one must show a green health code proving good health. This is obtained by scanning a mosaic through a mobile app. The green health code depends on a number of different factors, including travel history in the last 14 days. For the customers, the system is reassuring.
我觉得这个比较安全，让每个顾客能够感觉到整个城市的一个保障，然后让那些店里的员工也感觉到上海这个城市是很安全的一个城市。
But for those who obtain a red code and are in good health, no explanation is given. This is the case for this man, who had no one to appeal to when he just finished quarantine after a trip to a different province.
因为我们这边写字楼就是需要登记嘛，还需要每天的一个测温，第一次需要出示这个随身码，它需要判断你是否正常健康，所以就是我当时是红色，就没有办法，不太合理吧，但是也是一种防疫的一种手段吧。
The precautionary measures are reinforcing the Chinese state's surveillance. After analyzing the code of one of these apps, this journalist found that once registered, the user's data was handed over to the police.
There's nothing on the app to tell you that the police are in any way involved. It says that this is a government service, but then it doesn't sort of specify beyond that, so it's pretty surprising to then see this beacon that's immediately going to police.
Has the pandemic become an opportunity for China to boost surveillance of its citizens? According to the authorities, these are just exceptional measures.
Okay, there are actually 2 questions through the chat, so let me have a look. First question here, is China already preparing for something big by buying up dollars? Let me see, and that's a question by Edward. And there I have a second question, let me have a look at that one. Do you feel the battle for world economic dominance is a 2-horse race between the US and China, or will other countries perhaps join? Okay, both excellent, interesting questions. First question, China preparing by buying dollars. Well, that's actually a really big story. And that's not something that's happening only recently. Basically, since China's economy is growing really fast, basically could say, especially from the 1990s on, China has already been buying a lot of dollars through the bond market. China has been buying these. This is important because it gives credit to the United States, which means that the United States can buy up goods from China. So there's really a lot of sound economic logic here also. China wants to give the US credit because they can use that credit to buy Chinese goods. Actually, if you look at recently, China has actually been a bit more careful with buying up US dollars. Partly because it's worrying about how things are going with the US. All these sanctions are making it more difficult to have good relations. So China is actually looking to other places. So I do think China is preparing for big things, yes. I don't think it's going to go through the way of buying dollars. I think really China's big play is going to be technology, which we're going to talk about in a moment, and it's going to be by creating all these economic alliances with other countries. So trying to build what I mentioned, the Belt and Road Initiative. All these large infrastructure projects that link it with Pakistan, with Russia, with Thailand, Singapore, and Europe as well. I'm going to say a bit more about that in a moment. And that also brings me to the second question here. Is this a 2-horse race? Well, I just ended by saying, I don't think it's just going to be these two. That's the difference with the Cold War. There are other powers currently. The thing is, though, no other bloc, I think, is as powerful as these two. Russia has its capabilities, the EU has it, and I'll say something about the EU in the third part. India also has great potential. So all of these countries, they do not want to be part of one of these 2 other blocs. They want to be independent. But none of these blocs is capable enough to form a separate pole. So what I actually think is going to happen is that they're going to work together. But this is something I'll get back to in the third part. There are even more questions? No, I think this is the question we had before. Here's another question. You just raised the concept of Thucydides' trap. How does the current situation differ from the transition between the UK and the US as hegemonic powers? That's an interesting question. So maybe let me give some context for the other people. The Thucydides trap is what I mentioned. That's about this dynamic where a rising power and a declining power always get into conflict, and even war is very, very, very well possible. And this example is, of course, interesting because this is an example, one of the few examples where there wasn't a war. The UK was the great power until the first part of the 20th century. And then, finally, the US became the great power, of course, after the Second World War, but it didn't fight the UK. Well, I mean, that's indeed a positive example of one example where it didn't end up in war. But of course, if we look deeper into that example, the reason it didn't become war between them was because it was war with someone else. It was because Germany actually was trying to break up the system and actually had the potential almost to control like all of Europe and a great part of Asia. And this is what brought the US and the UK together into an alliance, and which is why the US could peacefully take over power from the UK. If that didn't happen, I think it actually would have gotten more difficult. There is actually a great historical record that actually says that in the UK, a lot of people were concerned about the United States. and the UK, actually we really thought, well, perhaps in the Civil War we should have tried to make sure this country got broken up into two parts and we wouldn't have this problem. So I think it's just that Germany saved the other two countries from war. There's one other question. I'll remember that question for later on, because it's a bigger question, a reflective question, and we still have two other topics I want to bring in for bringing all these questions together. So thank you here. I'll take this question about what we can learn from China for the final part. Let's first bring in some concepts about technology. So now a bit of a different perspective. Now let's go back to our normal daily life here. What did Corona do with our relationship with technology? I think that's actually kind of fascinating. Of course, the Corona crisis, it has to do with our healthcare, and now we know it's about economy and social problems. But I think this is really going to be a crisis that's going to be remembered, that it really truly showed us how deeply we are intertwined with digitalization. Just think, I mean, all the things that have happened in just the last few months, you can, I say, categorize them in like 4 different groups. And the first category is things we already did, but started doing much more. This is the picture you're seeing here, right? We were already watching Netflix. And suddenly we were all frozen at home. So yes, grateful that we had this great television all the time, instead of having to watch linear television in the past. Gaming, I think, is another example here, right? There was already a lot of people doing online gaming. But what we see happening here, right? Suddenly parents were at home with their kids all day. And I think many parents were very happy that we have this online gaming, which made sure that at least during those full days, there were some other things to do as well. So first of all, things we already did, we started doing a lot more. I think maybe also the example of online shopping. I think many people were getting used to it, getting your groceries, getting your deliveries, getting food online. And now suddenly in Corona, it wasn't just nice, it was a solution for all these places that were either closed or dangerous. Second thing I think that happened is things that we wanted to do but never really happened, now happened. Think here about video conferencing at work. Everyone was talking about it, it should happen somehow, but no, everyone always needed to be there for this meeting. And suddenly now we learned, hey, we wanted to do it and we got the momentum now, so we're learning how to do it. And in the course of a few weeks, everyone learned how to do the video conferencing at work. The same in classrooms. Years and years talking about EdTech, e-learning. And in the course of a few weeks, every school, from primary to tertiary level, suddenly created the digital school. Healthcare. All the time we were thinking about, can't we digitalize it more? But always reluctant and fearful about what this would mean, and if we could do it in a safe way. And suddenly people were now having consults with their doctor online. So secondly, things we wanted to do and now finally learned how to do it. Third, I think what we saw is that there were all kinds of things that we dreamt of doing, but were still futuristic ideas. Suddenly now became feasible. Here, I'm thinking about things like technologies like drones. Of course, some people had them already, but this was really very fun and didn't really serve a very practical goal. And suddenly what we saw is all around the world, just like we saw in the clip also, drones were used for public order. They're used to help people to make sure the government had a view of what's going on, when and where. The same with autonomous vehicles. In Singapore, there we had at least like the robo-dog, kind of like a creepy thing actually, a bit of an, you'll see it in a moment, an object, looks like a dog but without a head, moving around the streets, making sure that people weren't moving too close to each other, making sure social distancing helped, and that it worked. So all these futuristic things also started really happening. And fourth, I think the fourth thing that happened in our relationship with technology is that we started using technology against Corona itself. So not just against the consequences, not just making sure that we are amused at home or that we can get delivery, but actually bringing in technology to tackle the issue of Corona. And I think here also there are really fascinating things going on globally. There's this online database, Kaggle, and basically what it does is that it tries to create a database about everything we know about corona. Healthcare data, but any kind of data. And just creating this vast database so that scientists can crunch the numbers. Using a technology of machine learning, which is a very dynamic element of artificial intelligence currently, and trying to see, going through all this data, if we can find interesting patterns that will help us tackle this crisis in a better way. There are all kinds of other projects where people are using technology against corona. Hospitals are creating these models where doctors that have to do triage are being assisted by their digital systems, helping them make concrete decisions. Here we actually have the example of the Singapore's RoboDog. So we're seeing all these interesting examples. We're seeing people are using technology to tackle the core of the crisis itself, corona. So 4 dynamics, 4 trends I would describe. Corona made sure that things we already did, we did them more. Things we wanted to do, we suddenly learned how. Things we were dreaming of, we got a bit of a taste of. And we were actually purposely creating technology to tackle this issue. So that is why I think really this crisis also is about our relationship with technology. The question then, of course, is, what's next? What does this mean for the future? Well, I can see about 3 different types of patterns or type of responses emerging in this relationship with technology. The first response basically is get back to normal. Of course, we're seeing this all around. People said, well, these were extreme cases, and now let's go back to things as they were. And in many cases, of course, that makes a lot of sense. Trying to celebrate Easter or Mother's Day online, probably not something that will stick with us. Right? It was very creative that people did it in this way, but many things will return to their physical situation of before. Also, of course, we're seeing it. Many offices, not so much, but schools already, they're turning back into the physical spaces that they were before. So, some parts we're actually going back. Of course, I think that's just one response, and it's not going to be the primary response, because we're really not going to be able to go back. Basically, you could say Corona gave us a bit of a picture of the future. And you can't just go unsee that and go back. So I think one of the other responses, and I think we're seeing that already quite a lot around us, is the idea of, well, we've seen the future, let's move ahead. Let's use technology even more and more. We've seen how this can be done. And I think this is happening in a lot of spaces where people are really trying to, the changes that are happening now, try to enforce them. And I think here we need to be careful, because sometimes this is really going easily too far. We're using Corona now and the technology that we've put in place here to create all kinds of other things that in the past we didn't have time for, weren't efficient enough for. Now to do that quickly online to make sure it's covered. I'll come back to this in a moment. What I think is important here, a lot of interesting things can come from this. This fast forward into the future. I think one of the things, and this is one of the big topics I also want to discuss here with you today, is that especially the field of AI, artificial intelligence, can really get a big impulse from what's going on with Corona now. Because basically, what is AI? It's an attempt to replicate, strengthen, or even replace human intelligence. And you could, if you say it very abstractly, basically what Corona does is that it shows the liability of having to rely on certain human intelligence somewhere. Whether that's the human that needs to make sure that the goods are brought to your home, whether that's the person that needs to make sure that the tram you're going in is being driven. All these things have become kind of liabilities, at least currently. And as long as this crisis is here, we need to create spaces where we don't need that other human. I think this is in the abstract form, one of the big things that Corona is teaching us. Or that Corona is having as an effect, and pushing us to look for new ways in which we can use machines to do what we used to do. So one of my predictions would be really that the field of autonomous vehicles, self-driving cars, but also robot dogs like these, drones, facial recognition, all kinds of forms of artificial intelligence, they will actually get a tremendous push, much more investments. Because we know there's a big market for it. There's this. We could imagine the next crisis in the future, where again we have something like a pandemic like this, and then wouldn't it be great if we can let all our public transport just drive without having any human drivers, without we're having much less people in harm's way in the hospitals. All these people are working there. So I'm thinking these kind of topics are really going to, these type of technologies are really going to get a push from the corona crisis. Now finally, I've discussed what can we see in the future. So we have this response of let's try to go back to what we had in the past. Then we have this second impulse, which is I think very strong. Try to go into the future, try to use even more technologies like AI. And the third response, and I really hope that that third response is also coming along more and more, is that we use the corona crisis and its impact on technology as a mirror. So not as something that just needs to stay this way, kind of like, a bit like the television series Black Mirror. A picture of our not too distant future, where we can see what we had to do when it was necessary, but that we can also reflect on. Are all these things that we're doing with technology, otherwise they would have just gone slowly and slowly, now suddenly we see them in full form, in full force. And now we can ask, do we want it this way? What are the difficult questions that we need to ask to make sure that we use this technology in a responsible way? Because I think one of the things we've truly learned from Corona is that we've become dependent on digital technologies. This crisis and this response that we have now would not have been possible 10 years ago. Our internet cables wouldn't be capable of putting all those video content on there. Drones weren't as cheap to be used in this way. Food delivery didn't have this logistics system that it is there now. So now we're dependent. So let's think about the right way to organize this. Let's think about the right rules. And let me end up here, and then we go to a second part of Q&A, end up here with one example where I think we really need to think about the way we use technology responsible. And that's the example of the Corona apps. This is something many governments around the world are implementing. Also here in the Netherlands, there's this big project of creating a Corona app. An app that is going to make sure that we make sure that social distancing is done correctly, and in this way help us during the crisis. Possibly this can bring us a lot of good. Perhaps this can really help us enforce social distancing and make the world safer. But I would argue, make sure that we ask the right questions about how to apply these technologies. And let me mention a few questions that we need to ask. One of the questions are, how do we make sure that we remain in control of these technologies that we're using? So if we're making a Corona app, do we really want companies like Google and Apple in the United States to be the developers of these technologies? If it is a foreign company that is making this, how do we make sure that the data that's being used, that the decisions that these programs make, that we have a possibility to control them, or at least check them, to make sure that we as a democracy can question, why is it that this app is saying that you're not allowed to leave the door and you are? So do we make sure, before we get into this whole process and get ourselves hooked on a new app, ask these questions how we can keep control of what's going on. Next set of questions that I think we need to ask is, how do we make sure that the technology, even if the technology works, the whole ecosystem around it works as well? What does this mean? It means that perhaps we can find a technical way that this Corona app will work. That says, well, hey, I'm getting close to someone who has Corona. I need to make sure, or I need to go home now because I was too close. But there are all kinds of technical things where this can go wrong, right? We know the examples of Bluetooth technology that might say that, well, my neighbor is 2 meters across behind a wall, I'm in danger. But of course, there isn't a danger because there's a wall. Also, really basic questions. We want this technology, and even if it works, if you want to use an app, you need a smartphone. But here's the thing. Some of the people we really want to protect, like the elderly, often don't have these technologies. And if they do, don't really know how to use them well. So even if this technology itself works, how can we make sure that all the technical features are in place, that people use it in a right way, and that we truly help the people that we want to help? People who don't have a lot of money, can't buy smartphones. Are we going to, does this app mean that they're going to have less rights? Finally, questions I think that we need to ask if we want to do something like a Corona app, is how will people behave? The app itself might work perfectly. But what if people start to behave in a different way because of it? Now, of course, we're all very much used to it. Wherever we go, look around. Where are the other people? What am I touching? How do I make sure that my hands are clean? What if we get accustomed to this app? If we come into a room and it says, well, there's nobody there with Corona. Can we let down our guard? Are we perhaps going to act a bit reckless? Because now we think, hey, the app says I'm okay. So even if this app works correctly, might it actually have as an effect that our behavior changes? We start to do strange things, and then the danger increases again. We get this false sense of safety. These are all questions that I think that we need to ask if we want to push ahead with embracing all these new technologies. This, I think, is required. This is, I think, if we use Corona as in the right way, namely as a mirror of a future, and a mirror for which we ask, what way exactly are we going to do this in a responsible way? Now, again, let's have some time. We have some time for Q&A on this topic of technology. So let's see if there are people who want to ask or make a remark. You have another question in the chat box. Let me have a look. Interesting question. A question by Tariq Zaidi. In light of the fourth industrial revolution that's going on, how do you perceive the usage of AI in state capitalist authoritarian surveillance states like the UAE? Yeah, that's an interesting question. That's actually very much why I made this point, that yes, we can embrace technology, but make sure we need to ask the questions about responsible use. Make sure that it doesn't impinge on our rights. Because I think, indeed, what we're seeing around the world is that Corona is actually an excuse to use technologies that really impinge on people's rights. The UAE is a country that's using a lot of technologies. They even have their Ministry of AI, so they really want to embrace this technology. But for many countries, whether it's the UAE, but the same holds for countries like Russia, Israel, China. We've seen quite a few examples. If you're going to create an app that checks where people are, if people are required to use that app, if they can't leave the door, which is happening in a lot of countries, they're required to have the app. If they don't use the app and they're being called and they can't prove that they're at home while having Corona, they'll be fined. This, of course, is a tremendously powerful instrument for actually controlling your population. We're seeing this a lot, I think, and Corona is a great excuse, especially in these type of states. It's also really easily to link it with other kinds of goals. If it's going to be possible to know where everyone in your society is, why not make sure that you look a little bit extra to all your political opponents or minorities that might cause a problem? So yes, I think we're seeing Corona is now being used as an excuse to create oppressive technology, and that's why we all need to work on more responsive technology. Yeah, let me see, there's another question above there, which brings us back to the first topic, but that's fine. Let's see. The US military is a lot bigger than China's. Can they use that in a way? A question from Huub. Yeah, so if you put China and the US together, we're going back to the geopolitics theme, you can basically compare them along a range of different variables. And there are strengths and weaknesses for both countries. The US still outranks China in almost any field. It's still a bigger economy, although China is rapidly closing in. The US, of course, it's militarily much more powerful. It's in terms of innovation, it's still very powerful. The US has a much safer geographic environment. So there are quite a few things that make the US strong. China is rapidly closing in. Now, so there's this distribution. But specifically the dimension of the military. Yes, the US military is far superior than the Chinese. It's bigger, it's more innovative, its spending is also a lot bigger. I mean, it's really interesting. The US is always complaining how much China is spending on the military. It's still nowhere close to what the US is spending on the military. And it's increasing under Trump with this whole space force that he's creating now. The US military has experience, which the Chinese doesn't. Chinese military, of course, it's fought wars, but these were mostly land wars, guerrilla wars, say in Vietnam, say against their civil war opponents. But China doesn't really have experience as a military fighting abroad. So yes, the US military still is way powerful. What does this mean for their tension? It basically means that actually, if a war were to happen, the chances are bigger that the US would start it than China would. Because China knows it's weaker here. One of the reasons why we can be sure that China will not push really big confrontation with the US is because it knows that currently, and for the foreseeable future, it will remain the weaker in a military conflict. And the US actually might try to force this field closer and show its strength, say in the South China Sea, because it knows on this field it will win. Which means China actually will try to divert its attention to other domains and actually see if it can make the battle more in terms of economics, because that's where China is stronger. There's another question here. Let me have a look here. By the way, if anyone wants to ask a question from the people here with the video, and please don't be shy. I think it would also be really great if someone would like to ask their question live here in the studio, because we'll be able to see you here. But that's an invitation. Let me look at the next question. How big of an issue is privacy going to be? Is it going to be a major point in political programs? Could there be people who refuse to use apps even against the law? Yeah. As I said, I think Corona is really a mirror on technology. We were worrying a little bit about privacy, and now suddenly we all just had to skip it for a short while. People were using Zoom. Schools suddenly had to transition everything to big US platforms, not knowing exactly what the rights were and who has the data. So for a short time, we forgot it a little bit. But I think what's going to happen, and at least I hope what's going to happen, is that because it's a mirror, because now we can clearly see, hey, wait a second, we were forced on these platforms, and now we suddenly see what this means. How much tremendous privacy we are losing, but also how this can be used. The example we just discussed, how it can be used to oppress people. That I think now the case for privacy could become stronger. But that's, I think, a long game. In the near future, we'll still remain in this crisis mode. And actually, I think we might have the situation where we're actually just going to be forced to give up a little bit of privacy, just to get things working again. But I hope, because it's such a clear mirror, it will wake more people up. Yeah. Okay, well, there are quite a few more questions, but we need to go to the third part now, and I'll see if we can get these questions later on for the last part of the Q&A. Okay, so we've talked with each other about geopolitics, we've talked about technology. Now let's go to a third theme that kind of brings these two together, and so I hope that in the end also with your questions we can really round this up and get a bit of a scenario of where the world is going. And the third topic, the last topic I want to discuss, is globalization. Where is this going? What is the future of globalization? And let's look at a video clip to see one answer to that.
Good morning, good morning. Today, the college adopted a whole package on our digital strategy. It is the white book for artificial intelligence and the data strategy. We want to boost European artificial intelligence by attracting more than 20 billion euros per year for the next decade. To create these European Union data spaces and cloud infrastructure, we want to trigger investment of 4 to 6 billion euros. Artificial intelligence must serve people, and therefore artificial intelligence must always comply with people's rights. We want to encourage our businesses, our researchers, the innovators, the entrepreneurs to develop artificial intelligence, and we want to encourage our citizens to feel confident to use it. We have to unleash this potential.
So let's bring these topics together, and I'd like to do that through the lens of globalization. Where is that going? Of course, we've come from a period where we've had rapid globalization. All our economies have been linked, tremendous supply chains that go around the world. What will Corona do with that? And I think one of the answers, an answer that we see a lot of evidence for, is perhaps we'll go into deglobalization. That these global networks will unwind. That's what this picture illustrates, Corona breaking up this one global world. And we see all kinds of evidence for that, right? We see it in all kinds of trade figures that are collapsing. We see it in things like all kinds of competition that's emerging between countries, and countries that are, they don't want to be dependent on others anymore. So for instance, what we're seeing now with Corona is the issue of medicine. We've realized with globalization it's become so efficient that we've all come to rely on medicine mostly from China or from India. And now people are saying, well, that shouldn't be the case. We should bring all this production back. We should make sure that our economy can create these crucial things. We should create them for ourselves. And of course, another piece of evidence for this dynamic of deglobalization is that we're seeing that countries are trying to fight for themselves. This is the response that we saw in the European Union initially. We want to take care of our own problems. We're not going to pay for other people's problems. And of course, this idea that globalization is in retreat and that countries are going to be more protectionist is older. Corona perhaps might give it a push, but it was already a big global trend. Of course, Donald Trump got elected on the policy America First, which meant no longer trying to create this global system of equality, but putting American, especially economic interests first. So yes, there is, I think, a very powerful strand that is trying to bring in protectionism and unwind this global system as we've known it for the last few decades. However, I don't really think that's going to be an option, for two reasons. One, this is just going to be very costly. That's always, that's the classical case against protectionism and trying to bring everything within national borders. Everything is just going to get very expensive if you're going to try to make things that cheaper countries can make themselves. This is the classical argument. It's an important argument, but because it's smarter to do things global doesn't mean it's going to happen. So I think this is an argument against deglobalization, but it's not strong enough. Even if it's better for us, someone like Donald Trump can still try to push and see if he can bring things back. So even though it's not smart, this argument is not enough. But I think another argument is more difficult. And that's that it's not just costly, currently it's become impossible. We've had a phase before of protectionism, that was in the 1930s, and that was also very costly, but many goods, it was able to bring them back into national borders. But what's happened now, and this is something that mostly happened starting in the 1990s, that so many goods have become so tremendously complex that even to make the simplest things, we need tremendous supply chains that span across the globe. Perhaps the idea of bringing production back is the old model of a country making its own car. That's no longer the case. No country completely makes its own cars. Any car is a supply chain that goes through dozens of countries, all sourcing in these goods that somehow together create this car. So globalization has become simply too complex to completely unwind it and bring it back within national borders. So what can we expect then? Where does that bring us? Because I don't think also that the traditional globalization as we knew it can exist in its current form. There are tensions, and we need to take serious also the questions that Corona raises. It is difficult. We can't continue on the old form. So how can we reform, or what kind of shape can globalization take so that we can tackle these challenges? I see three possible options. The first thing I think that we can do is that we can try to create more versatility, more resilience in our economies. Which basically means we're not going to try to produce everything in-house, but we're going to focus more on making sure that our country has a very complex skill set, that if we need to create something, we can slowly fill in the slack a little bit. This is one trend that we've already seen happening around, right? When the Corona crisis hit, suddenly chemical companies or pharmaceutical companies slowly started to say, well, perhaps we can also make mouth masks. Because we have a knowledge of fabrics or we have a knowledge of chemical compounds, we can use that in different fields. So trying to focus not on what you're making, but on the skill set behind what you're making. So that that skill set can suddenly be shifted towards a different field if that's required. If we suddenly need to ramp up production in something, can we make sure that other factories can help with that? So this, I think, is one of the big things that we can do. Focus not so much on production, but on skill sets. Second thing I think we can do is, if we can't bring in all these different products in-house, if we can't make sure that we make everything ourselves, but at the same time, we're afraid that we become dependent on one supplier, China in the case of medicine. A second thing that we can do is try to build in redundance. And what I mean with that is, we need to make sure that if we can't make it ourselves, at least we need to make sure that there's not just one other person who can make it. There need to be 2 or 3, at least. So this is another thing that I think Corona the way in which it will impact globalization. China has become the factory of the world. And we've come to experience this as a liability. So I think what we're going to see is that other countries are going to try to position themselves as an alternative. Quite a lot of things that China makes, perhaps India, if it invests for years and years, could take over part of that. Not by completely changing all these supply chains, but by making sure that there are 2 or 3 producers of the same things. Countries like Japan, South Korea also really have this capacity. So if we want in the future to no longer be really dependent on China for medicine, let's make sure that we invest in countries, third countries, that can also help us create these goods, that if a crisis happens, we're not just left with one producer, but we have options, we're resilient, we have redundancy that makes it possible for us to shift from one producer to the other. And finally, I think there's a third strategy that we can apply, and that's the strategy that, well, if globalization has become so complex that we really have no chance of bringing everything back into our national borders, what we can do is regionalize. Alone? No, we can't bring in all these goods back. But perhaps as regional blocks, there is a bigger chance of bringing more supply chains back. And I think this is really, this also brings back the geopolitical trend and the technology trend that I started this presentation with. I think this is perhaps the biggest effect that Corona will have on the world. Instead of one world in which everyone trades together in the WTO, negotiates together in the United Nations, I think we're going to go more towards a world of regions, where China is carving out its own space in East Asia, where Russia is kind of basically trying to create its power sphere again in the former Soviet Union, where India is trying to create an influence sphere all around the Indian Ocean. The US has its own influence sphere, and also Europe. as a few of the big blocks, and within these blocks, perhaps they have the mass to make sure that the globalization is a bit more limited, and that they can build more safety and more local production on this level of the region. This is what we also saw in the clip before. And this also brings in the topic of technology. To round these different topics off and bring them together, I think we're seeing this movement towards regionalization. And we've seen in the second talk today that really we've learned we're dependent on technology right now. So our social system, our economy really requires this digital infrastructure. So bringing these two things together, a focus on more regional globalization and the dependence on technology, means, I think, that we're going to see more regional technology spaces. In many parts of the world, this has already happened, right? I mean, we have, of course, the US technology power, which is great also in our countries. It's very, but in countries like China and Russia, they already decided we need a regional technology system, blocking US companies and creating their own, whether it's Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, Huawei, Hikvision, TikTok, all these different platforms creating their own version because they know this is the future of globalization and this technology is crucial for all the country's citizens and their economies. Russia has done something similar, and I think now, and this is also where my hope is actually a little bit, that Europe is also waking up to this reality. Are we going to create our own Googles or Facebooks? I don't think so. And I also don't think we should really try. I mean, some parts perhaps are really domains where we've lost out on. But that doesn't mean that we should just leave this digital sphere by itself. If you look at the European Union already, there are quite a few interesting proposals of trying to take back a little bit of that digital sphere and build European alternatives. Again, not those big technology platforms, but parts of, you could say, the internet's backbone, its infrastructure. One thing is what you saw Margaret Vestager just speak about, is Europe's AI strategy. This is about the intelligence of the digital sphere. Europe is rapidly increasing its investments, creating all kinds of AI strategies and linking them together to try to create a separate European version of AI. A version of AI that is not so much focused on the free market as in the US, not so much focused on a powerful state as in China, but an AI that's really focused on citizens and their freedoms. So we see in the field of AI that Europe is trying to build an alternative. I think we also see this in the field of infrastructure, and there the debate is going a bit slowly. And this is the whole debate that we're seeing now around, with, of course, with things like Huawei. Countries all around are asking, should we allow it in our telecom infrastructure? The US is really pushing us a lot, try to make sure that we're not using Huawei. They have their own alternative, of course. They want us to use Cisco. At the same time, we're seeing that there are possible European alternatives. Companies like Ericsson, Nokia, actually also can create this technological infrastructure. So what I think that we're seeing emerge in Europe slowly is the idea we shouldn't just wait. If we have these capacities with these Scandinavian companies, let's make sure we build on these capacities so we have an alternative. That if we have this crucial telecom infrastructure, we won't be reliant on any foreign country, but we have a company that's within our own jurisdiction. So we're seeing infrastructure that's Europe is investing on. We're seeing the intelligence layer of artificial intelligence. Europe is building all kinds of other elements of the digital space. Europe launched its Galilei project, which is basically Europe's alternative to GPS, a new system for global navigation, which, because it's a newer generation, actually also has a lot more detail. So we're also going to be able to do location and finding out location-based services, developing those. Europe is building its own alternative for that. And finally, a really new piece in the policy that we've seen last few weeks actually emerging is a new idea called Gaia-X, a French-German proposal to basically create an own European data sphere. a data sphere that runs on a European cloud. And slowly there are more and more details emerging about how Europe wants to build this up. Will Europe be able to create its own digital world? I'm not sure. This is really a big challenge. But what I hope has become clear in the course of these 3 presentations, first of all, the world is really getting all the old geopolitical conflicts again, and they're getting more intense. Secondly, we've noticed that technology has become crucial, and we are dependent on digital technology. So I hope, thirdly, this means as Europe, we come to stand up for ourselves, and if you add all these different policies together, Europe might be able to create its own digital sphere. And that is something I think is truly hopeful for the future. Thank you. That's what I would like to present here with the 3 presentations. Let's now see for the questions, if there are people who have questions, either on the chat or for the people on the video links. There were actually a few questions also before, but let me see if we can perhaps bring those back. Yes, we have here a question. What does it mean for the world economy if several human jobs are replaced by machines? Yeah, this I think is really the big, one of the big questions relating especially to AI and automation. I think over the last few years we've had quite a few reports and research suggesting that a large part of our jobs are going to disappear because of machines. And I've actually also argued the push for this is going to increase. Corona has actually showed us how frail we are if we're relying on people to do all kinds of dangerous things. So I think in quite a few jobs actually we're going to see more quickly that those jobs are going to be replaced. I actually am not convinced that it means that we're all going to be unemployed, or even that a large part of the population is going to be unemployed. First of all, I think we've seen in history many times that a new technology threatened a lot of jobs. And usually what we see is that we as humans, we value different things. If something becomes cheaper by machines, we start to value other things, and we create whole new kinds of parts of the economy that we didn't have before, simply because we want something that we didn't have before. So we'll start to pay for things that we weren't willing to pay for in the past. And I think we're still very far off from machines really being able to do most of the things that we do. I think actually what we're usually seeing is that machines aren't completely replacing jobs. What they're doing is that they're replacing tasks within jobs. So a job is usually a whole bundle of tasks. Certain tasks are going to be automated. Everything that has to do with like searching through information or finding easy patterns or applying a general rule, those are the tasks machines can do. We have other things that are more creative, other abilities that are more critical or more complex. I think those parts in jobs will actually increase. This could actually make jobs also very demanding and more difficult, but that's another issue. But these are just 2 reasons why I would argue we wouldn't have to fear for mass unemployment, but we do need to fear that our jobs are going to be changed a lot. And this is going to require a lot of reskilling. Okay, I think we have time only for one more question. There's a question by Jasper. Facing on the innovation strength China has, can we call China a threat at this moment in this corona crisis? Looking at the independence of Europe in relation to China. Yeah, difficult, complex question. I think China is also this. This is actually a view that we're also starting to see in the European Union. The European Union wrote a report last year in which it basically said our relationship with China now has become complex. And it's different things. China is in some fields, it's a partner. For instance, at keeping going with the climate policies, the US isn't a partner, but China is. So there, yes, it's a partner. In other fields, China is what it calls a strategic rival. So this has a lot to do, I think, with this question also. Certain industries that we're good at. China could be a country that tries to become dominant there and threatens our... so there, we need to engage it. Not as an enemy, but engage it as a rival, that we need to make sure that we're have enough competition against it. And the report says in other fields we're actually really at odds with China. And this has to do with things like human rights issues. So China, yes, I think China now we're having a very complex relationship with it. In certain fields, yes, it's going to become a rival. And as I argued in the first part, I think at this moment in Corona, here in Europe, we're still very much deep in that crisis mode. And China, I think, as no other country, knows how to exploit a crisis in a good way. This is what it's done through the financial crisis as well. I remember how it got hold of the Greece harbor of Piraeus, or 2 terminals there, because it helped the country in the depth of the crisis. So we need to be vigilant. When we're tackling this crisis, won't we give away too much, too easily to China, because it could help us in the crisis? In that sense, I think we should really think hard and look at ways in which we make sure that we're not going to get locked in a dependent relationship with China. But should it be an enemy? I don't think so. I don't think we should go on in this global frame that we have now of a Cold War, whether it's either with or against China. I think we should see it in this complex way and try to balance it. Balance China, but also balance the United States. I think that is all, sadly, that we have time for. There were really interesting questions, and there's so much more be able to like to talk about with you more, but I think that's all we have time for. So I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Haroon. I hope everyone also at home enjoyed this lecture. I, for one, thought it was a very clear breakdown of what the future might have to offer for Europe. And I'm really happy that you ended on a hopeful note for Europe, which is, I think, all we need right now. Thank you so much to the audience at home for checking in. This is actually the last lecture of the 4 lectures that we staged here on this virtual stage of this spring online program by College Club. We want to thank our partners Faber and Univate for making this possible. And well, we actually want to wish you a great summer, and we hope to see you after it. So for now, we want to wish you a great evening, and well, we'll see you after the summer. Thank you wel. Thank you wel, dank je wel. Goodbye.